these are perhaps less accurate than we might hope. Anybody like to start at all? Or, just before we go, a couple of rules really. If when you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself and then just unmute whilst you're actually asking the question, that just helps us with noise management. If possible, do turn your video off to help us with bandwidth, and if everybody's happy with this, we're recording as well. So if you've got a problem with that, let us know. If you'd like to ask a question, either type it into the chat box or raise a hand or whatever on the using the little symbol under reactions, and we'll spot you and bring you in. So one thing, Tim, I think the Nation Calendar Project is a really fascinating piece of work, isn't it? And is it all volunteer collected, the data?
Yes, entirely. So it's a UK scheme. We do get records from the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man as well, but it does have a bias towards southern England. It's effectively biased towards where people live, which is not unexpected. So we get fewer records as you go north. We'd love to have more records from Northern Ireland, for example, and we don't have as many as we wish we could have.
Right, yeah, and it's very difficult to recruit people, isn't it? It's quite a commitment, I guess.
Yes, although when you first events are quite easy to record because you're out walking the dog, preferably, and you notice that a particular tree has come into leaf or a plant has come into flower. It's the end of year events which are a bit more difficult to record and have never been quite so popular. So, recording the last swallow requires you to make a note of every time you see a swallow, and then it's obvious when they've disappeared.
Yeah, we, as you probably know, we're trying to replicate the Flora selborniensis from 1766 down here in Selborne, although it's not quite gone the way we anticipated, because obviously people haven't been able to come in and volunteer. So it's kind of fallen to 2 or 3 people to do pretty much all of the recording, and I'm like you just mentioned there, I'm starting to worry a bit about end of year events.
Yes, I mean spring events have always been much more popular. If you look at any of the calendars that people have created over the centuries, I suppose, then the spring events have always been much more popular. And I suppose they're easier to define as well. So we do run both spring and autumn schemes. So the autumn scheme includes things like fruit ripening and colour changes and leaf falls in trees. But they're not quite so sharply defined as the spring events.
Yeah, like, are they more variable by things like rainfall and there are more variables that affect those things?
Yes, I mean autumn is much more tricky. Spring is really driven by, in this country, by temperature, so that we're not usually limited by rainfall or soil moisture, so that plants are not restricted in that way. If you go to other environments, desert environments, for example, then flowering is often triggered by rainfall. But here, temperature is the big driver, and it's usually the temperature 1, 2, or 3 months before the event. In autumn, it's more difficult because it's you can have a frost, you can have gales, you can have heavy rainfall that trigger or accelerate leaf fall.
Okay, tricky. So maybe there are inherent difficulties in this data anyway, without Aiken's interference in the process.
Well, it's I mean the naturalist journals they've been transcribed, haven't they? And they're online and they're available. I mean, there is a question about whether Gilbert White wrote rhubarb leaves or rhubarb stalks at one point, but it wouldn't necessarily be such a huge job to go through those and extract them, and so I do know someone who's desperate for work over the winter months when he's a bit bored, and he may well be willing to go through them again and reassess them and look at which particular years the events come from, because that is very important.
Yes, yeah, that would be really helpful. Do keep us posted on that. We'd be interested. And of course, for anybody listening, don't forget we sell modern copies of the Nature's Calendar blank and ready for completion in the shop here at Gilbert White. So we're always happy to encourage people to use the same collecting methods and formats.
And is that also available by post as well?
It certainly is, yes.
Well,
So no one has got an excuse. We expect lots of orders on Monday morning.
looks like a perfect Christmas present.
Absolutely.
Yeah, ready for the new year.
Yep, get your Christmas presents bought early this year. And certainly we've got a big supply here.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, the question I was thinking of asking is, do we know a lot about Aiken? I mean, who was he and what did he do?
I think John Aiken was a medical doctor. He produced a calendar before this of his own, and there's a wonderful resource called the Biodiversity Heritage Library. I don't know whether everyone's familiar with this, but the Biodiversity Heritage Library has digitized a huge amount of old books. It's the sort of books that you would rarely get access to. And it does include things like some of Darwin's own copies of books where he's written in the margins. And there's a huge resource there of digitized books that you can just sit at home during a pandemic, for example, and you can go through them and you can look at them. And many of these old books are there so that Leonard Jennings' naturalist calendar, for example, is there, and the natural history of Selborne is there, and I think John Aiken's calendar is also there.
Interesting. I think we've got a question from Stephanie. So if you can unmute yourself and join us.
Yeah, first of all, just wanted to say thank you for a fantastic talk, Tim. That was really interesting. For me, it's always been, particularly coming, with access to the museum's fantastic resource over at the Natural History Museum. It's almost like time traveling in a way, isn't it? Going back through these old records and being able to compare them to today and compare multiple data sets. Have you included any records from collections material within the research that you're doing? Or has it all been just biological records like Gilbert's journals?
Well, we've digitized all of the Royal Meteorological Society's records, so that goes back to 1875. The Robert Marsham family records, they go back to 1736. Before that, and there are a few odd records. I think the oldest record I think is 1695 that we have. But when you talked about collections, were you talking about the Natural History Museum collections?
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking about like physical actual specimens, because the data that's held in there, which very often doesn't make it into these sorts of projects, because quite often the data is very difficult to extract from the actual herbarium specimens, for example.
Yes, certainly people have been looking at herbarium specimens. There's been several papers on this, and there was one by your colleagues in the museum that were looking at was it monkey orchid or spider orchid? I think it was monkey orchid.
Well, we actually looked at a few different orchid species.
Yes.
The Orchid Observers project a few years ago.
Yes, and there are there's other ones. There's a coltsfoot one, for example, from Canada, where it's an introduced weed, where there's lots of records of coltsfoot in herbarium. And now that herbarium records are digitized and more easily available, again, you can often sit at a desk or on the landing like I am at the moment and extract records from databases from right around the world. So there is huge potential there. We don't add those records to Nature's calendar, or we haven't added them to Nature's calendar, partly because it's difficult to know exactly what stage the herbarium specimen represents. So they'll typically be close to the beginning of flowering, but they won't necessarily be the first flower, and they won't necessarily be full flowering as well. So there is some question mark about whether we can relate herbarium records directly to the human observation records that we mostly collect.
Really interesting. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
I was quite interested by the difference, Tim, in oops, I hope I'm not muted. Why not? In the fact that plant species are flowering earlier and bird species arriving later, do you what? Okay, if you take away the potential difficulty with observation because we're more urban now, are you aware of any other reasons that could be causing that? I mean, obviously plants is temperature, but the bird arrivals is an interesting one, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, well, if for swallows, for example, you're experiencing temperature right from 50 degrees south up to 60 degrees north. So they're experiencing huge range of temperatures on their journey from Southern Africa, and the temperatures may not have changed at the same rate across all of those environments. So changes to their arrival time are really triggered once they've got into they've entered into Europe, and then at that point they can accelerate slightly and arrive earlier. But I think populations of most bird species are now lower than they would have been at the time of Gilbert White. If you remember, at Gilbert White's time, everyone had a horse. All of the traction, all of the movement of goods was done by horse. There was huge amounts of horse dung and a correspondingly huge amount of insects resulting from that, and there was masses of insect prey for birds to live on, and there's much less of that now than there was then. So fortunately we can get out the statistics on horses from about 1801. I think the Ministry of Agriculture recorded horses used in agriculture, and it's surprising how many there were employed in various counties.
Yeah, and I guess in cities as well at the time.
Yes, yeah, and there would also have been milking cows in the middle of large towns as well, because you couldn't transport milk large distances and keep it reasonably fresh. So you had dairies in the middle of towns.
It's fascinating. What caused the Royal Met Society records to stop being taken? Was it just closed down?
No, the problem was that one of the coordinators, the last coordinator, was a chap called Major H.C. Gunton, who was particularly interested in moths, and he expanded the scheme to include quite a number of moth varieties. He decided in 1947 that he didn't want to carry on coordinating it, and the Royal Meteorological Society couldn't find anyone else to take the scheme on, and they appealed to other organisations like the British Ornithological Union and the British Ecological Society, but in 1947 no one was really interested in taking it on. And I think at that time the Royal Meteorological Society were also wondering why they, as an organisation concerned with recording rainfall and temperature and so on, why were they recording plants and birds? So sadly it fell by the wayside at that point.
That's a great shame.
Yeah.
Graham, I think you've got a question if you'd like to come in there.
Yeah, thanks. I was still wondering if there are any really counterintuitive observations, or rather, I'm sure there must be, because I mean, evolution's a real tinker, isn't it? And things like timings or events are going to be controlled by day length. They're going to be controlled by temperature and other things. And in a sense, it's not the absolute values of any of those that are probably the key features. It's the combinations. And when you start getting sort of relative combinations, I wondered whether there was sort of evidence of sometimes perhaps it almost working in the opposite way, where they were responding in a way that was perhaps disadvantageous.
Well, certainly, I mean, with the coltsfoot one, the coltsfoot issue is causing me problems.
I mean, that was the one that I kind of picked up on,
yes.
hence my comment, really. But
yes.
You focused on a selection of species. Just wonder if whether that is the example or whether there are other ones.
Well, I mean, according to those records, it would appear that swallows are leaving earlier now than they did then, and to me that doesn't make a huge amount of sense.
No, I picked up on that as well. You're right. That's counterintuitive to me.
Because I mean, they're capable of producing more broods, so that, you know, possibly instead of producing 2 broods, they might produce 3 and stay a little bit longer if the weather was still favourable. And as we probably all know, you know, autumns are now, you know, generally very pleasant. Certainly in the last few decades, autumns have been much more amenable, I suppose, than previously. And we pick up odd records like second flowering of apple trees in the autumn, which and odd events like that. But the swallow leaving earlier, I'm not sure makes a lot of sense. And
actually, now that I think about it, that may not be so counterintuitive, because it could well be, what they come all the way up to Britain, shall we say, to breed. And if really reproduction is their main purpose, if you've arrived a little bit earlier.
Well, it's dawn.
yeah. Okay, everyone heard that. Yeah. If basically you've raised your broods, what else is there to do? Given that autumn is on its way, perhaps it is advantageous to get out of the country as early as possible. So possibly that may not be, if you can feed up elsewhere en route, leaving early may not be perhaps such a counterintuitive. It certainly struck me as counterintuitive first, but now that I actually think about it, it may not be.
I think for single brooded bird species, ones that only produce one clutch of eggs, and as soon as they've finished and they've raised their young, they can then be off back south again. I can understand it for that type of bird species, but for those that are capable of producing, slipping another clutch in and getting it in under the radar before winter sets in, I don't understand quite so much. But I mean, there are other data sources that could be examined to look at that in more detail. And it would be nice to try and match up Gilbert White's, last swallow records with specific years. Were they just from, particularly hot and dry years, or were they just from, particularly cold years? That would be interesting to know.
I guess if we knew exactly what triggered migration southwards again, that would help.
There's a lot of work that's been done on that.
Yeah,
so,
very particularly recently. Yeah.
And I'm not expert enough to give you the answer to that one, I'm afraid. So, and it often varies between bird species. So, I mean, recently, you're probably familiar with a number of bird species that have become resident over winter. So, black cap and chiffchaff are the two obvious ones where we now get records through most of the winter. But most species have at least a partial migration. So even birds which we think of as resident, like blackbirds and thrushes and robins, part of the population migrates out of Britain each year.
Yeah, well, there's another Gilbert White conundrum for another day, probably.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Well, that's been really interesting, Tim. Thank you, and thanks for the question askers too. I think we've discussed some interesting wider aspects around Tim's work. So I think it remains for me to say thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Tim, for your input. That's really appreciated, and we'll all be in touch soon, and hopefully we'll see you down here at the 301st birthday next year.
Okay.
Cheers, thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.